It was of my sister and me when she was 2 and I was 3, and we lived in a very nice hamlet outside Stoke-on-Trent, on the outskirts of Stoke-on-Trent, and we every morning used to take a milk churn down to the farmers about 300 yards away to collect the milk for the morning tea. That's my earliest memory.
I think it was where I lived when I was about 3 with an aunt, not a real aunt, just a friend of my mother's. Really, it's a long story because my father went into service in the war. The war started the day after my 3rd birthday, so we moved out of our rented house in Pinner in Middlesex, and we went to stay with my auntie Ivy and her daughter Mary, and that was a big house in a cul-de-sac, and I can remember falling off a bike outside the house.
The family consisted of me. When I started, I was the child number 1, and after me, over the next 15 years, my mother had another 5. So I lived with all those children in this small terraced house, 2 up, 2 down, and my mother and father used to live in one room, a bedroom, and the rest of the children were split into 2 beds in the second room, and that was where we lived.
We didn't have a house of our own because my father was in the army, so we stayed first with one aunt, and then we went to live with my cousin Patrick's grandmother in Westbury, which is near Shrewsbury. Very, very rural, beautiful part of the country. And he was 6 months older than me, so between about 4 and 5.5, something like that, or maybe a bit longer. We lived together in Westbury, and I played with him. I thought he was wonderful because he was a little bit older than me, and he was very naughty and I was very good, but I followed him everywhere.
The most exciting I ever got was my first 2-wheel bicycle. But typical of me was that I was cross because it was second-hand. And that epitomizes my nature. Throughout my life, I suspect that's true.
So, and then I went later to Wallasey. Again, my father I never saw because he was in the army, but my mother and I went to Wallasey and stayed with another non-real auntie. She was, I actually don't know where she came from, but she was very nice. Another Auntie Connie. That was in Wallasey. So that was a much longer period than in Westbury. And that was, it was fun. It was wartime. And my mother and my aunt had, I don't know where they had the contacts from, but we had American soldiers often came to the house and brought candy. And I had lots of friends there. So although I was an only child, it was fun.
I remember nothing about the war at all. You'll have to remember, there were no conversations in my house at all. Conversation in my childhood didn't exist. People shouted and bawled at one another, and there was no television. We had radio, and I listened to radio a lot.
I think friends were very important. I played outside almost all the time. When I was in Wallasey, we played on a bomb site where the 2 houses at the top of the road had been destroyed by bombing, but not rebuilt, and so it was just a mess with wildflowers growing, but there was lots of rubble and stuff to play with. That's one of the things I did.
The one place you always went to in the local area in my day was a local church club. And the church club met several days of the week, but the big night of the week was Friday night, when there was a dance. And that's when I met Rita, and we danced, and I think she fancied me, and I certainly fancied her. And so it was, I mustn't go into too much detail for you, but it was very enjoyable.
I did first year of A-levels. I went to a grammar school and was expected to go to college, but I did biology and what did I do? Double biology. I can't remember what the other one was. Anyway, I only did first year, and I realised that I had done absolutely no work at all and that I wouldn't pass the exam, so I left. And I went to a secretarial college in Birkenhead, which is what you did in those days. I think girls were either going to be nurses, secretaries, or get married, probably. Teachers also. But I did 6 months of secretarial college. I've always been pleased that I know how to do shorthand. I've used it such a lot. I still do. And in fact, if I'm bored, I translate things into shorthand because it's a sort of way of keeping alert.
I wasn't very successful in the grammar school. In fact, I've never been successful in any of my schools because I never worked as hard as I could have done or should have done. And so I never achieved any kind of measure of success in the classes. And actually my friends, some of whom I mentioned, but all of them in the classroom I was in, all of them went to university at 18, which of course I didn't do because I was required then to go into national service. So you're allowed to pick, to start with, whether you want to go into the Navy, the Army or the Air Force. And because I'd done something rather lucky in the last year of my school, although I wasn't happy working, I did join the local air training squadron, which was next to an airfield, next to my school, and I joined this group, and we went every Sunday to the airfield a mile away and flew gliders. So actually I worked very hard all day pushing gliders around this field until it was your turn to have a go. And I had a go, and I was successful because I went solo. And that was a big thing in those days. And so when I came to decide whether to join an armed force, conscripted, I joined the Air Force.
I had always been interested in medical matters, and I decided I would like to do radiography. So I applied to do, I didn't do a degree in those days, it was a 2-year course, and I was taken on to a hospital in Wallasey, but I did the training, the physics and biology was at a college in Liverpool. I had never done physics before, I hadn't done physics at school, and I did find that very difficult. However, I managed to pass my first year, to the astonishment of my physics teacher. And then during the second year, before I qualified, a friend suggested that she was going to visit her family in Montreal. And, no, actually, I've got that wrong. Yeah, that's right. Anyway, the family in Montreal, so I wanted to go too. I was then 19, I think. So at that time, they had a scheme whereby you could emigrate for £10. So the fare to get to Canada was £10. There were no stipulation about whether you would have to stay for any period of time. So we did that, and we went to stay with her family in Montreal, her uncle. Eventually, having left there, we both found jobs, both secretaries, and we got a flat together, which was astonishing to me because as a 19-year-old, this was a really nice flat. It was only one room, and we had only a sofa bed really for the two of us, but we had our own bathroom and kitchen, quite like a modern flat really, and it was warm, unlike anything in England. It was, and it was stylish really. I loved that. Worked in Montreal for the, as you would pronounce it there, Aluminum Company of Canada. And I did lie. I told them I had a degree, and so they gave me a job as a sort of journalist. I went out and did stories for them. I remember going to a Russian ship in Montreal, and I met an English boy, and I was going out with him quite heavily.
My first wife was very keen on classical music and going to the cinema. I didn't like either. And so, in any case, she was an only child, Rita, and her mother and father were poor. But an only child gets completely waited on hand and foot. And she was whatever she wanted to do, they always got the money together and gave her the thing to do. As a matter of fact, the most enjoyable time I've ever had, one of the most enjoyable things, was on Sunday afternoon. My future mother-in-law went to the local shop and bought a quarter pound of sliced ham, and we had that for tea, and it was delicious. And it was organised, the house was, and it was tidy, and it was an entire comparison, bad comparison, with how I lived with the rest of my family.
I met even though I had the other boyfriend, I met an Irish guy there who had the lovely name of Chesley Milliken, and he was very Irish and had he'd ridden horses a lot, but he was working at the stock exchange, and he said I had 1,000, or maybe it wasn't as much as 1,000, anyway, some money, enough money to get a return if I needed to, and he said, if you give me that money, I'll invest it and you'll make a fortune. And so I did, and lost it all, of course. So I then had to work to get enough money to get back if I needed. That romance failed, and I did look him up on the internet later, and he's dead now, but he ended up as a pop group producer, and he was quite well known. Stayed in America. But I kept the other boyfriend, and we came back together we went from Montreal to New York and then sailed from New York, and we got engaged, and I took him home to my parents, who were not impressed. My mother said, he's a bit brash, isn't he? She was, really. But I found him very attractive. I mean, he lived in Pangbourne, near London. His family lived there, and I went to stay at the house, which was lovely, a beautiful house on the river, and he had a very nice family, brothers and sisters who I got on well with. But that, I went off him, really.
I was always a very competent pilot, and so that was easy for me. And all I had to do was to get into an aeroplane and give me the controls and I'll fly it. And I went into the Air Force at 18, and they sent me to a place called Cottesmore, which is in Rutland, a very nice place. I hadn't seen anything quite so pretty as that in my days in Stoke-on-Trent, I assure you. So then, it was a small, underpowered aircraft called Apprentice, and Flight Sergeant War was my instructor, and all the other instructors on the squadron were all officers, and he was quite pissed off about being a flight sergeant instead of an officer, and so he was quite unkind to me. But I could fly the aeroplane immediately and went solo in 5¼ hours. And so all that happened one day after 5 hours, when we got to the end of the runway, he said, "Okay, I'm getting out of here. I'll go back to the squadron and you can carry on flying," which I did.
My father hoped that I was going to want to go to university and do something important, but I didn't have any kind of either ambition or aspiration, really. I don't think it was uncommon at that stage. As a girl, you knew that the sort of middle-class thing to do was be a teacher, a nurse, or a secretary, and I just assumed that's what I would do.
We were once lectured to, when I was first joined the Air Force, by an old wartime navigator. And there were about 30 of us in this room, and he said, "Now listen, I want to give you some information. You're all going to be trained as pilots, as far as I can see. And as far as I'm concerned, you are creme de la creme. You've never had it so lucky, and you never will in your life. Because everybody worships pilots, and you'll notice that quite quickly." And he was, of course, he was right.
I don't think I thought anything about it, really. I wasn't that keen. The ambition of, I think, most girls then was to get married and have children. I wasn't that keen, either on the idea of weddings or. But I didn't think seriously about anything. I didn't have ambition to do or be anything, really. Just let things happen, which they did.
I was on a 4-year commission, incidentally. I've forgotten to mention that. And so I was only doing 4 years. And then, so at the end of that period, I went to join a full-time fighter squadron in the Middle East. It was the 249 Gold Coast Squadron. The 249 Squadron was what's called a DFGA unit. And that DFGA stands for Day Fighter Ground Attack. So Day Fighter was a useless exercise, but because the RAF in the beginning of the war, the Second World War, had been very successful in fighting the Germans, and they did it in a way which was, I still think, is amazingly competent. They had a Spitfire and a Hurricane at the beginning of the war, and they beat the Germans because it was a superior aeroplane. But because they beat the Germans, when I got to join the Air Force, the thing to do was still to try and beat the Germans. And this time they were not Germans, they were Russians. So our enemy was Russia. And that was the day fighter bit, which was quite boring. But the ground attack side of it was riveting. I absolutely adored that. What you did was your ground crew. I had my own ground crew, by the way, and my name on the aircraft, my aircraft. My ground crew would fill the aeroplane up with all the various places with with bullets, and with rockets and guns. And so almost every day, for an hour, we flew to a small airfield about half an hour from where I was living in Amman in Jordan. And we practiced shooting guns, firing rockets and dropping bombs. It was hugely enjoyable.
Well, there's a big difference now between the way women approach their post-education life and the way I did. It was then assumed that as a woman, you were just going to go and marry somebody and raise children and learn how to make cakes, which I never did. So it wasn't unusual. I'm very glad to say that it's quite different now.
And my fondest memory is my last job in the Air Force was to go to what's called an armament practice camp. An armament practice camp in those days was not in Jordan, it was in Cyprus. So we were we were sent with all your stuff to live for 3 weeks in an officer's mess in Cyprus. And then every day, in a concentrated way, you took your bullets and your rockets and your bombs and you took them somewhere where they measured how you performed in the airplane doing these, not dangerous, didn't allow them to be dangerous, at least I didn't. So we did that for 3 weeks and I came out top of the course. And every single, I've got it in the logbook next door, I'll show you one day. It's where every single aspect of my flying was described as exceptional. And my squadron commander, who didn't like me at all, he couldn't not write something fairly kind about me when I finished the course. And he said I was above average pilot. That's as close as it got. So that's my best memory, by a long way.
The idea was I did want to. I'd been to Canada, and so I had an awareness of other parts of the world, and I wanted to see more. I think I saw an advert somewhere for British Eagle, which was the company that I flew with first, and I went for an interview in London. I went specifically for the interview. I also applied to what was BOAC, as it was, British Airways. That was the Overseas Department of British Airways, and I didn't get in, but I did get into Eagle, which was a smaller airline, and they did a lot of holiday traffic, which was beginning, really. This was in the 60s, I guess. Late 50s. So it was early days for package holidays, and they were not particularly nice flights to do. They were all right going out, but then on the way back, everybody was very riotous and probably drunk and all wearing funny hats and things. They were quite funny.
I left the Air Force in December 1955. I immediately went on to the ground school to become a commercial pilot, because to be a commercial pilot, you have to have licenses which permit you to fly a certain aircraft to a certain weight, and the heavier the aeroplane. And as a captain, you had to have what's called an air traffic license, pilot's license, ALTP. And so I did the course, and for the next 6 months, I passed the exams to become an ordinary low-level pilot. It's just a co-pilot. And that was started in January 1956, and 6 months later, I had a commercial license.
Cyprus, I loved, and America. Well, I went to New York and to California. I did, and we could cross Canada actually to get to San Francisco. I loved both New York and San Francisco. Yeah, they were we did go pretty much everywhere in Europe, and that was wonderful because you didn't come straight back as you do now. We often had night stops there, particularly in Italy. I had lots of night stops. Rome, Naples.
Well, I joined the British Eagle, as I've mentioned, and as a co-pilot, and I'm through with some nice people, some not very nice people, because as a co-pilot, you're only invited to fly the airplane by the captain. It's never organised by anybody on the ground. And so sometimes, some weeks or months, you got to fly with somebody who didn't let you fly. It was up to him, the captain, to decide whether he was going to give you the opportunity to fly or not. I flew with some terrific guys who let me do every time they did a flight, I did a flight. They did a flight, I did a flight. By that I mean going to land the airplane.
Well, certainly one flight that I don't think we had any particularly important people apart from this one flight, which was it was a Viking. It was one of these awful old planes, and there were I think they only carried about 35 people, and they were all politicians going to a conference in Berlin, and we stayed at the same hotel as they were staying at. I'm trying to remember the names of... The only one I particularly remember is Violet Bonham Carter, who was the mother of Helena Bonham Carter. The grandmother of Helena Bonham Carter, I should say. It was her son, was her father. And I went up in the lift with her. There were several others, and in fact, I've got the passenger manifest somewhere, but I actually can't remember at the moment.
Well, undeservedly, pilots are regarded with some kind of awe and expertise which is beyond really what they deserve. And that's always been true, and it's still true today. So I think to be a competent airline pilot today, not just for what it's worth, is an exacting job. You can't do it half. You can't do it in bits and pieces. You do it, and if you don't, you kill people. So you try not to kill people, and you try and do the job of an airline pilot is to get from here to there as smoothly as possible, as safely as possible, and on time.
Well, I flew at a time when they were pretty much all women until I went to Transair. Then we did have some men, and then I did do a bit of flying after I was married when stewards were there, and I liked flying with stewards. Most of them were gay, but it was sort of slightly different atmosphere than all women. Mostly, even the biggest aeroplanes we flew on, nothing like as big as they are now, there'd only be three women, and then probably three men in the crew as well. So if we were staying over, it'd be 3 men and 3 women. I made good friends when I was flying. Still have many of them. We had lots of fun. Actually, the stewards introduced us to the fiddles that go on. I don't think any of us are smart enough to think of them, but they all had fiddles going on, usually involving booze or cigarettes.
I did fly with Elizabeth before we went on to this trip out of Manchester. Another crappy old aeroplane I won't mention, just did a few hours on it. And but Mrs. Hancock was on board as a stewardess, and you had to climb up. I may have told you this story. She had to climb up these steps to give us a cup of tea. About 6 foot in a vertical. And I was happy. I was already fancying Elizabeth. I wanted to say something to her. And I couldn't get the words. And she said to me, "Come on, Tony, spit it out."
Well, we were very attracted to each other, and it was pretty boring for all the other people on the crew, who I think found it all a bit nauseating. We did have, we had a great time. We had time in San Francisco and New York where we were perhaps there for a day and a night or something like that, but it was a great place to build a romance. The fact that he was not happily married meant that we decided that I don't remember whether it actually finished before we got back from Gander. I can't remember, but it did finish when we got back from the posting, and he and his wife split up, and we got married a couple of months later. Really, very, very small wedding.
Well, there was a trip we used to do down to West Africa, to Lagos, Nigeria, on this epoxy Viking we had to start with. And it all depended. There was a big cockpit compared with today. And we had a chap on board who, Polish, dead now, and he played an accordion and the violin. Oh Chichanya, oh Chichanya. That's a Hungarian song, and we used to persuade or threaten Frank. He's got to get his violin out in the cockpit, which he did. And he played to us, and that was exciting. I
definitely did want to have children, yeah, and I was happy to have... Suzanne was born in Cyprus, where we did another posting in Cyprus, and she was born in Nicosia. I wasn't very happy there because I didn't like being pregnant, and it turned out that the hospital where she was born was actually an abortion clinic, and it was not the best place to have a baby, really. I think she was the only baby there. Definitely the only baby with blonde hair.
I think I wanted to be ordinary. I wanted to do what everybody else did, and everybody else got married and had children. So it was of no discussion or conjecture at all.
In those days, these sort of things happened when you're pretty young. I don't think anything was very thoughtful or considered. It was assumed, and I was very happy. I was nearly 24 when Suzanne was born, so it's not very old, really.
Okay, I stopped flying very dramatically in 1970 because in a regular aviation medical, I was diagnosed with a diseased heart, and they took my flying license away immediately. Now, what they did, because I was always liked to be properly insured, I was insured for the maximum amount of money at the time, which was £20,000. I actually only got 19 for it. I won't go into. So I had then the people I was working with, which is basically fired me immediately. No license, no job, because at that time I was a training pilot on the BAC 111, and I used to go to customers and be a training pilot. That stopped immediately. Then I got my loss of license insurance, and I split it two ways. I invested it with a friend of mine, another friend of mine, Jack Lill, who died not long ago. And and also with my brothers in Stoke-on-Trent. It was a huge mistake going to work with my brothers in Stoke-on-Trent. It was rewinding the clock, and it's in a very uncomfortable way. And I was uncomfortable with it, but you have to remember the mental state I was in from being someone who was top of their world. As I told you already about the accolades you got as being a pilot. I know I wasn't one. And I noticed, I felt that very severely for a very long time. I suppose forever. I've always had it.
Well, I did fly a little bit after I was married and after I had Suzanne, who was the first child. I did do a little bit of night flying. If Tony was at home, I'd do a little bit of night flying. But I found that it was not particularly congenial because I didn't have... I was interested in children and household things, and they were all interested in their boyfriends.
So I left Stoke-on-Trent and left the company and started my own company importing illegal answering machines from Hong Kong. And we bought 50 sight unseen, and we advertised them one Sunday in the early days of the magazine. And bottom right hand corner, I remember that page well, there's a tiny little ad. The phone never stopped ringing. On Sunday night, Monday, by Tuesday, we sold out. Having
lived a life where you were responsible only for yourself, and then to be responsible for another 3 people is quite a challenge. I don't normally mind responsibility that much, but you do feel a bit, like you're playing God if you're making decisions for small people, which they probably don't want anyway.
Well, there's a lot of joy on the way, and there's a lot of humour, as long as you can enjoy the laughs and enjoy the successes, not the failures. But we had 3 children. Suzanne was the first. Caroline, our darling Caroline, was our second, and a very nice ordinary girl. And the third one was William.
Well, there were difficulties and there was hard bits, but on the whole, I think it was one of the best experiences I've had. You learn such a lot, not just about the child, but about yourself. It changes your perspective on everything. You have to learn about things that you'd never even contemplated before, and willingly do that.
Elizabeth will tell you that we came closer to divorce over Suzanne because Elizabeth says that I wanted her to go to a private school because she wasn't going to do any good if she didn't. And I am politically antipathetic to private schools. And she knew that. And so that was a fight. And I won. We didn't send her to a private school. And you could say, in retrospect, that's probably the unkindest thing I did to Suzanne and perhaps to Elizabeth.
Well, of course, you want the best for them, and you want them. The overwhelming thing is that you want them to be happy because nothing else really matters that much. The idea of success is not really of any great value, I don't think, because if you're not happy and successful, it's no good. So you're just hoping for happiness. But inevitably, you do want the best for them, so therefore at schools, you know, hoping that they will get to the best schools you can make for them, or manage to get them into. This was state system, all of it. But it's not just, you know, you go, as it was in my day, where you just went to the local school, apart from if you went to a grammar school, but still the local one. So there were challenges, but not unwelcome ones.
I've always had an inclination to discuss a situation of any kind with my children. And my mother and father never discussed. There was never such a thing as a conversation. Never. They were shouting and bawling and directing. And what, to do this, do that. And so the difference is huge.
I've discussed with my friend that being northern and the time of life that we were born, we were not touchy-feely. So I think that the North was contributing to that. So we didn't, you know, the current people, young, say to their mothers, "Love you," and all things like that. You'd never have done that in my day. You didn't say or do anything. You didn't hug. You didn't do anything emotionally physical with your children. I think that's probably a disadvantage. In fact, I'm sure it is, because Will, who is my only son, said he thought I was emotionally distant as a mother, and Caroline did as well. So I didn't feel it, but that was how it was perceived. So I'm guessing that's what it was. I think they have a lot to deal with, young parents now, because the world is a much more scary place than it was when I was a child. They have screens which are of great value, but also have difficulties, and so I think they have a hard time. And also it's a scary world, so the kids are not feeling as secure, I don't think, as I did. Even though I lived through a war, I never felt, I don't think, that it was a frightening place to live.
Luck plays the most important part of anybody's life, as you'll discover. And if you have bad luck, that's bad news. Bad luck is bad news. And if you have good luck, that's good news.
I did a degree with the Open University in my 40s, which I think covers that sort of period. And that was a major event, really. Even though I think I had a very good education in a grammar school, I didn't go on to further education, and I realised how terrific that was, and the experience was great. And that was a 6-year degree, and every summer you went to summer school at a different university. I found it a really, really exciting experience, very much like Educating Rita, if you've seen the film.
I carried on being helpful in organising and reorganising the coalmaster. And the biggest thing we had to do was to move from our out-of-date premises in Recklesham to the centre of Farnham, where we had another very nice series of offices.
Citizens Advice Bureau, it's now called just Citizens Advice. I did that for 25 years. I think it was 25. So I really, really enjoyed it. I loved it. I think if I think you did ask earlier what would be different. I think I would have liked to have done social work. I realised that, because not that Citizens Advice is social work, because you don't actually try and take on the management of somebody's life. You just give options. But to be able to, I like the research bit, because presenting a problem solving, I like problem solving, and so that there's lots of that. But involving people is even better. I'm not particularly sociable, but I like meeting people, and I like it's a pleasure to have them telling you their life story, which they do. But you don't have to be involved with them or necessarily. Well, you do it a little bit, but it's one stage removed. They're not friends, but they have problems, and it gives you quite a lot of. It gives you a kick to be able to at least partly help solve problems.
Well, what has been more important for me for the last 30 years is to become an active socialist. By that I mean a promoter of socialist. I use the expression of fairness, because social means fairness. And I'm most pleased with myself for resisting any temptation to give up being a socialist. I'm proudest of it. I'm more proud of being a socialist than I'm being a father. That'll surprise you.
Probably houses. You know, Tony and I have one thing that we're very good at together, which is making houses. Actually, even building one, but improving others. We're both very interested, and it's one of my greatest interests, really. I could do it again now, I'd love to, but it's physically a bit difficult now.
It's very important to live comfortably and enjoyably with whoever you're living with, and that includes your children. And especially if they've got interests which they excite them, is always to encourage whatever they do they were interested in. Always. And you know that as a grandson.